So rather than trying to avoid fear, he's presenting fear as something meaningful, and it's a signal. There's something behind it, and it's something there to understand. So in kind of making that even simpler, fear, I think, is often the canary in the coal mine. It's really telling us something important about what's actually happening in the company.
What we seek shapes what we build. This is If You Seek by Useberry. Hello, everybody. This is Nicole Fotaki. Welcome back to If You Seek. Today, we're here with John Clear, whose path into communities of practice began in design. After studying design communications and founding Red Lemonade Creative, he moved from traditional agency work into running design sprints and alignment workshops across industries like fintech and broadcasting. Now, through Unmake, John explores how teams work better together, designing communities of practice that strengthen collaboration and connect strategy to everyday work. In this conversation, we'll talk about what makes these communities different from traditional workshops, how they support business strategy, and why space for reflection matters more than ever. John, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, Nicole, really delighted to be here, and thanks for letting me be part of this Useberry podcast. Delighted to be here.
So let's start right at the heart of your current work.
Yep.
You've been building communities of practice inside companies, small peer-led group. Can you explain what these are and how they work? What makes them different from a team meeting or a training course?
Okay, great. So first of all, I started looking at communities of practice about 2 or 3 years ago, and I realized it's not really a new concept because I remember at the time seeing a painting by Raphael, the School of Athens. So if anyone's listening to the podcast, if you want to bring up a picture of the School of Athens, so it was painted like in the 1500s, so it's a long time ago. And what Raphael was doing, he was a Renaissance painter, and he was kind of moving from the Dark Ages into a new time of technology and science. And in the painting, he had this building. And inside the building, in the middle, he had people like Plato and Aristotle. So he had like Plato, who had kind of slightly more lofty ideas, and you can see his hand is held high. And you have Aristotle, which his hand is held low, which is a slightly more grounded person. But within that painting as well, there was lots of other polymaths, designers, mathematicians, astronomers, all from different eras, like Pythagoras and who else is there? Socrates, loads of others, okay? So the whole idea that Raphael was trying to get across is that you can take all of these different people, all very different, all different views, but when you put them under one roof and you can see them all sharing ideas with different people, new ideas can come. And that's what the Renaissance was about. And I think in some ways, I know in your last podcast you talked about AI, and we'll probably end up talking about AI here too, that, it is a new era, I think, what's happening now, and it is a renaissance. So communities of practice of bringing people under one roof, which, Raphael did with, people from different eras. I think we're now in this unique position to bring people together from all different areas of walks of life within our work and working together and working on different ideas. So if we were to define a community of practice, really, you could say that it's a group of people that connect around a shared area of expertise. And what they're doing really is they're building this shared knowledge and approaches to advance their fields of work. So it's about making these people, let's say in an organization, feel more connected, more celebrated and productive. And the result really is about retaining and nurturing talent in what is an ever-changing landscape. So you could think of communities of practice like learning labs embedded within the workflow of companies. So how are they made up? Kind of three things to point out really here is that they're voluntary groups. So it's about bringing people together who want to do it. So it's not about making people do it. It's peer-led, so there's less hierarchical structure within it. So it's peer-to-peer. You're looking for diverse people across the departments. That's really important. And then what comes from it is actually more organic than structured objectives as such. So it can go on tangents, and you have to be comfortable with that because that's okay. And so from my own background, I know you'd mentioned in the introduction that I came from a workshop background, and I've been in workshops for years and short cycle workshops, and I facilitate them. But the whole idea, even with communities of practice, that it's about the content and the direction, really, that comes from the participants themselves. It's not from me as such. I'm just guiding people along the way. And then we can talk near the end, I suppose, a little bit about the platforms, etc., that you can use for communities practice, because they are in person, but they're also, online. And we'll talk about them later. But basically, what you're trying to do with a community of practice, it's like hosting a dinner party or a supper or something like that. So what you're trying to do is you're preparing the table for people to eat or to talk. You're taking their coats and you're making them feel more relaxed, or you're introducing them to the room. And what you're doing then is you're allowing conversations to flow, and you're introducing people to each other as well. And it's about making people more comfortable and safe. And then that's where, when you sit at the table, the conversation starts. It goes off in tangents, new stories, some insights, and God forbid, you might actually have a bit of fun as well. So what I like to say as well is that they can start casual and small. That they're not like I said, they're not structured, but you don't have to put a lot of energy into them. You can just, between two people, you can start. But the idea is that as they grow, they're incredibly and easily scalable. And one really interesting things about communities of practice as well is that they're almost impossible to copy, because they're uniquely yours. So you're not going to get fast followers with this. This is uniquely yours. And then there's, in terms of the kind of communities of practice that are out there, if I was to generalize and say that this kind of macro view is that there's three types. There's internal communities of practice. So within an organization like Useberry, you could have a community of practice. They're external. That's where you can be part of a community practice, let's say on user testing or something. And you could have loads of people from different companies coming together, creating a community practice, so they can learn more from each other about, user testing, etc. And then there's an interesting one as well, which I'm just starting to look at, and that's product led. So if you could imagine, you have a product in a company and you have people in the community of practice for that product, but you also introduce the customers, and they're part of that community of practice as well. But the whole idea here, you have to make sure and create value for people at both sides. But it's a great way to develop a product beyond just, let's say, user testing, etc. Yeah, and so your question then around what makes them different from team meetings or training courses is that, well, in team meetings, you're solving for today's problems. And you're putting out fires, you're working on the initial objectives that the company are working on. But in training, you're sometimes just learning from someone else's solutions. So it's the kind of the sage on the stage, the sage on the stage. It's that one-way conversation. And some of the solutions that people are presenting to you, they're post-rationalized based on their own experiences and, let's say, not yours. So, some of these ideas are, tied up in a fancy ribbon, and they look really exciting. And when you're watching them or learning from them, they all make sense. But after a while, when you leave that training or leave that particular event, you might feel a little bit empty afterwards, because it just doesn't really connect with what you're doing. So in a community of practice, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to empower the talent to build tomorrow's capabilities together, both personally in what you're trying to learn, but also for the company as well. So I try to design for emerging rather than these kind of predetermined outcomes. So instead of here's what you need to know, it's kind of, you're more talking about what are we trying to figure out together.
Yeah, it sounds like people start showing up not just as their role, but as themselves.
Yes.
And I think that really shifts everything. And I really love the analogy you gave in the beginning. Great
All right.
example.
Cool.
So these communities aren't just social, though. They also connect to business strategy. Can you walk us through how they help companies move forward?
Yeah. So, like, management can be part of a community of practice as well. And they do have the power to, say, engage with the community of practice around, company strategy. And very simply talking about that in terms of company strategy, you could say, where are we trying to play and how are we trying to win? And if people understand that, that gives them a sense of purpose in the community as well. But if you want to look at it kind of in a structure or this kind of knowledge management way of a community of practice, there is a guy called Harold Jarche. It's Garche. And if you type in Harold Jarche into the browser and chart or something, you should bring up a chart. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to explain how that works. And it's a really, really good way to look at how a community of practice works. So if you imagine at the top, you have the kind of tacit knowledge, and that's the diverse, unstructured conversations that we have. when we're, you're curious and you're seeking to understand something within your industry, or you've read an article or something's not working, etc. So basically you're at that point where it's some structured conversation, it's a lot of dots and they're not really connected. And then if you could imagine, you're taking that kind of tacit knowledge that we all do. If you're working in user experience, you're looking at articles and things like that all the time. And you're maybe not quite sure how to connect the dots. But what a community practice does, that brings you down to that middle section. And that's the community practice is the leverage, because it allows all that soup in your head and all those unconnected dots, and allows you to start learning out loud and trying to make sense of it all together. And so that's what the community practice is. But then what's important, and you were talking about strategy, is that the bottom part, and it's about transferring all that knowledge into explicit knowledge that can be utilized then for projects and for jobs and boosting your career as well. So you're basically helping to create value for yourselves and for the company. And it's an opportunity as well to introduce quick workshops as well. So what I find is that it's not an online experience. It has to be personal, in person as well. So when you're working in a community practice, you might come across a challenge, etc., and you might decide, well, could we do a quick workshop to try and work that out? So that's a great area that the community practice add, is that it's in person. It can be online, but it's testing ideas and having that comfort and the security of a space to do that. And then if you could imagine with that kind of top, middle, and bottom, that it actually works the other way back up as well. So now if you can imagine that the line going from the bottom to the top. So first of all, you take that explicit knowledge and learnings in projects and you move that then into the community of practice where you can talk about it and learn from it. And then that feeds into the individual's tacit knowledge interest. So then when they're looking at articles or things that they're interested in, it starts to influence what they're looking for too as well. And then that loop begins, and it's almost like a flywheel of know-how that begins to develop in the company. So I think communities of practice thrive. They don't thrive through rigid goal setting, but they really work through kind of these shared explorations and these kind of serendipitous learnings we'll talk about. And these are organic exchanges of ideas. And if you're kind of unsure about that, saying, this sounds a bit kind of flighty, that's okay. There's actually a good book to look at as well about this. Now, I was only reading it a couple of months ago, and I think it's a few years old now. It's by Kenneth Stanley, and it's called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And the most interesting part of the headline, or the name of the book, is Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, the Myth of the Objective. And I think that's really, really interesting, because in the book, what Kenneth is saying is that all in our work, we're obsessed. And that's a bit of a problem. So basically, objectives work really well for these kind of day-to-day tasks and just looking a little bit down the line, but you're not really unsurfacing something new or great or exciting. So what communities of practice do is they kind of foster that greatness by valuing connection, the curiosity, and the emergence of not mechanical stuff, but more or objective-led stuff. It's just a little bit lighter, and when you're not focused on the objective, it gives the breathing room for new things to come out. So I suppose when you're talking to the Useberry audience, that it's kind of like an iteration cycle. So user testing isn't a one-time thing. So as you know, you learn, you test, you iterate, you test again and again. So communities of practice works some way similar. Each conversation really is an iteration of how to solve problems together.
Yeah, thanks for the book recommendation. And it's so powerful how something that starts, let's say, in a small room can ripple out into the bigger organization.
Yeah, and it is, like I said, it is organic and it takes time as well. So, it's worth noting that if you do start a community practice, that it usually takes about 6 months to bear fruit, and you have to stick with it, really, and then later on we can talk about some of those things as well, that you will notice, or the steps, or the kind of individual natural progressions of a workshop, or not a workshop, I should say, but a community.
Okay, let's talk about the context these conversations are happening in, because a lot of it is shifting.
Yeah.
So a lot of designers are feeling pressure to keep up with change, with AI, as you mentioned before, organizational shifts, tool fatigue. You work in spaces where people are allowed to admit fear. What does that matter? Why does that matter now?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Fear, and I think let's focus on the word fear, okay? There's a song by Ian Brown from the Stone Roses, and he uses in the song he uses the word fear, and he uses it as an acronym, and FEAR for everything a reason, you know. And what he's trying to do there, he's trying to flip that negative connotation of fear into something more reflective or more empowering for people. So rather than trying to avoid fear, he's presenting fear as something meaningful, and it's a signal. There's something behind it, and it's something there to understand. So, in kind of making that even simpler, fear, I think, is often the canary in the coal mine. It's really telling us something important about what's actually happening in the company. So, when people say, I'm worried about AI, will it make my role obsolete? These are the questions you will hear. Or you'll hear things like, I don't really understand this organizational change or this change management coming upon us, and how does that affect my work, etc. And that's when real adaptation can begin, I think. So basically, fear is information if it's allowed to be, I think. So people can name their concerns in a positive way and in a community practice, and a community practice is about keeping things positive. So what they're doing is really they're identifying real risk that the organization possibly needs to address. So take note, HR, it's a really good source for initiating a community practice as well. And then going back to like the Useberry audience, that the community practice is like user testing. You learn more from watching people struggle rather than hear them say things like, oh, everything's fine, or not really saying anything, or not saying what's really on their mind. So it's actually seeing things happen viscerally, real, you know. And communities of practice, they're what would you say? They're more. It's about really watching ourselves struggle, and then sourcing solutions and learning from it. And one of the things I've noticed in the last while, personally, just talking to different people in different organizations, that I've had these kind of, shall we say, unofficial conversations, and I've heard management say to me that we're now creating systems within the organization that are designed internally by people that will that it could possibly make them obsolete. So, you know, that's a concern. And then on the other side of the conversation, I've heard UX people working in organizations saying that they're working on projects now that they believe are making them obsolete. And I think that a lot of people saying that at the moment, but I don't think it's exactly true. I think people don't really know what's ahead. And I think that's just the beauty of life, really. We just don't know everything. It's going to be unexpected. But it's currently not a conversation really that's been had openly and honestly within companies. And I think a community of practice could add value to this as a subject within it, you know? And then in terms of like, I think you were saying, well, what's you know, what happens when that's missing? The problem is, I think that in the operations of the company, you just get these kind of surface level solutions because people solve for looking competent rather than just being effective as such. And then everyone is duplicating their same struggles in work, in their head, or in isolation, you know. And the best people and your best talent could tend to leave, and I think that's happening, rather than admit that they're struggling or they lack trust within the organization. And then what happens then is there's no real innovation, because even experimentation sounds like a little bit risky the way everything's hanging on a thread at the moment. So it's like trying to design. It's like the problem here is that it's like trying to design without user research. So you end up solving for the wrong problems because you're not really hearing what actual people need. You know, so we spend so much time user testing everything else, but we're not really focusing on ourselves within that as well. And then I think that if companies give people permission to not know everything and permission to ask those questions and voice their ideas, they're the ones, or they are the companies that will actually know the best, or will know the most going forward. So feeling seen and heard, I think, is a key product of high performing teams. I think everyone could relate to that. But going back to fear, then really, it can then, in that context, become like a powerful leverage in a community of practice. And for people, it's almost an anti-fragile mechanism. It's where a crisis can make the people actually stronger. And I think that there will be a lot more crises down the line. It just seems to be a lot more happening in succession. So a community of practice, really, you could say then, starts to build culture. So what is culture? the difficult one to work out. What I do know that it's not pizzas and beach cleans. It's it's very difficult to describe what culture is, but I think all of us know how it feels. And for me, that feeling is in your tummy on a Sunday night, and I think everyone can relate to that. So without a culture and a community, teams tend to drift, if you could say that, in calm waters, and they pretty much sink in storms. And with culture, I suppose there's an enormous sense of well-being and purpose, where people are empowered to be, like I said, anti-fragile in these times of crisis. And I think it's really is the ultimate growth mindset for a company. And a community of practice really is implementing that kind of growth mindset for the people and for the company.
Yeah, it's not so often that you hear organizations making space for fear. But I think when they do, it tends to surface things that, as you mentioned, matter most.
Yeah, I think so. And it's not necessarily, you don't set up a community of practice going, okay, let's have a big bitching session. You know what I mean? I'm not happy about this. What it does is, if you get together around a shared interest, then these issues will come up and they can be addressed, because there is usually solutions for them. And I always find that the solutions are actually within the company, not outside of the company.
Okay, this ties into something I know you feel strongly about, making space for the unexpected. You've said that efficiency is boring and that part of the value in these communities is the chance for serendipity. What do you mean by that? Why is unpredictability sometimes the best part of the process?
True. I'll go back to your earlier point of efficiency is boring there, because I'm slightly taken out of context there, but not really. I do find it a little bit boring. Okay. When you have a successful product, you can make things more efficient. So that's where, it's about increasing profit, or your problem is definitively understood. Then we can start working on efficiency. Okay. But another book reference here is that this Jules Goddard has a book called Uncommon Sense, Common Nonsense, I think it's called. And he said a really good line in the book, and this quote has stuck with me forever. And he said that strategy is the rare and precious skill of staying one step ahead of the need to be efficient. So I think if we focus on just being efficient in this kind of economic sense, we don't allow for new opportunities. We don't allow to foster serendipity. And serendipity are the things that allow us to increase our surface look area. Because a lot of things are random, and it's about increasing our surface look area. And that's where really great ideas come from. And I think it's Christian Busch, I think is his name. He had a book called Connecting the Dots. Do you remember earlier on I was mentioning connecting the dots?
Mm-hmm.
And he said that there's kind of three types of serendipity that you can foster. And he calls the first one the Archimedes sense of serendipity. That's where you have these chance interventions. So basically Archimedes lowering himself into the vat, and then he's just having this flash of an idea for measuring the mass of an object, etc. And then he calls the second one the post-it note. So that's where the problem has not been solved in the terms of post-it notes. In other words, they were trying to create a glue, and then they realized the glue didn't work, but it could be reapplied, and it was sticky, but reapplied lightly. And that's where the idea came from, post-it notes. So it's putting different ideas together. And then the thunderbolt, where ideas just come from you out of nowhere. So what the community of practice is trying to do is provide these techniques that Christian is talking about, to raise the odds of this serendipity happening. Because if you keep doing what everyone else is doing, that you can't really expect to come up with anything really different. So that's it, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. So many teams are trying to control everything. But maybe if they loosened up a bit, they might have even moved faster, or yeah.
Oh yeah, I think it's really about just being a little bit more human about everything, And I think AI is giving us the opportunity to take away some of those mundane tasks and things that should be maybe should be automated anyway, and it's just going to allow us to be more human.
I'm curious. Have you seen a moment where a casual insight or shared story led to something no one was planning, but turned out to be valuable for the business? What's the role of spontaneity in a structured organization?
Okay. Well, just in terms of user testing, the most valuable insight often comes from watching what people do when they go off script. We've all had those situations where you go, now we weren't asking that, but that's interesting. And some of it's the same really with communities of practice. The most valuable moments often happen, like you were saying, when you go off agenda. So I remember a group where they had uncovered a challenge about this product feature direction just in the community. And we decided to make a workshop out of that, just to have a look at it and see what we could do. And people were open and were all excited about it. And when we had the workshop, they asked, "Oh, there's an intern. Can we bring the intern into the workshop for a bit of experience?" And we're like, "Yeah, absolutely. Why not?" And then what happens is we hit a real roadblock in the workshops. I don't know if you're ever in those situations where it feels like a complete dead end and you're like, "Oh God, what do we do next?" But basically, the intern saved me and saved the group. The intern basically just flicked the switch and bypassed the challenge. So there's lots of it's really about having, it's not one little thing, it's not one thing, it's loads of little things that come together, and all these small little serendipitous moments. And many great inventions came from unpredictability really as well. Like even penicillin, when the guy who was inventing that, I can't think of his name now, but he basically went off to Paris, I think, for the weekend, and he left some sort of cheese in a jar or something, and mold grew from it over the weekend when he wasn't there, and then he came back. So it's those moments where unplanned as such, but there is an element of structure within them as well, and that's where we got penicillin. And you were asking about what the role of spontaneity in a structured organization. Most organizations they're kind of built predictably around the objective that we were talking earlier on. So, but innovation requires a bit of chaos. So my role in designing containers for spontaneity, that's what I'm trying to do, and just create enough, let's say, structure for people to feel safe, but a bit of openness for a bit of surprise as well. And like improv comedy, it looks like it's just all happening naturally, but there is a little structure behind it, and that enables the creativity of the comedy. And like a few years ago, I actually worked for Edinburgh Fringe, the comedy festival, doing design. So I got to hang out with comedians, but I also got to hang out with creative directors of comedy who hire comedians as well. And I remember I was sitting down with a creative director, and he was basically there because you're hiring comedians for the rest of the year. And I was like, "Oh, is this comedian good or this comedian bad?" And he was like, No, don't watch the comedian, watch the audience. So when he's watching a gig, he's watching the ebbs and flows within the audience. And like, if you look at a comedian as well, they know their lines, they know what they have to say. I've been a host, like a community of practice. They know what they have to do, but what they're really doing, they're almost doing that on autopilot. They're watching the crowd, and they're just getting the feeling of how the crowd is going, where to lift them, where to lower them, all of that kind of thing. So it's just an interesting analogy there. And but anyway, back to organizations. If they only optimize for efficiency, well, it's just kind of like, maybe if they're only optimizing for efficiency, they're kind of like designers who really only iterate on existing solutions. So they get incrementally better at yesterday's problems while missing maybe tomorrow's opportunities.
As you mentioned before, also, these moments can't be replicated. So yeah, and I guess, but they do change how people show up in future conversations. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, they do.
If you've ever felt stuck with a confusing or low quality research submission, we get it. That's why we've upgraded Useberry's participant pool so you can review each submission, return ones that don't meet your standards, and message participants directly for clarification. Built for more transparency, more control, and even better results. Check it out at useberry.com. Another thing you do is bring people from different functions into the same space, like UX, operations, product engineering. What happens when you bring those perspectives together in a non-hierarchical setting? Does it reshape how people see the bigger picture?
Yeah. So, like when you remove the reporting structure or these like set objectives or that general day-to-day stuff, kind of something magical begins to happen there, where people stop. And I think you said this earlier on, people stop representing their department and they start representing their expertise. So like a UX researcher isn't speaking for research anymore. They're sharing what they've learned about users. And so from my background in workshops, I kind of understand how different disciplines, think and communicate. And in communities of practice, those language language barriers do dissolve, like you were saying. What seems obvious in one function is a revelation in another. So this happens all the time. So many of the answers reside sleeping in the community itself, or sleeping in the company itself. We just haven't really unearthed them. And this happens all the time. So sometimes there might be a push to use consultants and bring them in and get them out again. But sometimes I find that with a community of practice, it tends to solve a lot of those problems internally.
So for someone listening, maybe inside a big company who's curious about this way of working, what's one small step they could take to start or support communities like this? What should they look for?
Yeah, well, the first thing to do really is to make it easy. Find another person who's wrestling with the same thing you are, and suggest grabbing a coffee and having a talk about it. And that's pretty much it. It's just a starting point. It doesn't really need, shall we say, permission or budgets to begin. All they need really is just that kind of shared curiosity and a shared challenge as such. So, and as well, instead of, let's say, saying, how can we get leadership to support this? You don't start like that. Just start with, well, what conversations do we need to have that would be valuable regardless of who's listening, And what should you be looking for? Look for curiosity over certainty again. So it's about, not getting locked down into that. People who ask things like, how do you handle, rather than here's how it should be, is the way to go. So what you're looking for is kind of willingness to share struggles, not just successes, I should say. So look for those kind of reoccurring challenges that keep coming up across the different projects. That's a good way to go. And it's kind of like, again, from Useberry audience, that just like when you test with users before launching a product, you start testing these conversations with your colleagues before setting them in stone as such. You could say it's kind of user testing for internal processes. So start personal, what you're genuinely curious about, then find one ally working on some similar challenges. You could make it a regular 30-minute conversation weekly or monthly. Try and stay focused maybe on a specific area, and document and share what you're learning. And some of the most impactful communities have all started out with just two people going, well, what are we trying to figure out here? And the magic, like I said, is not in the structure, it's in the willingness to learn. And like a good facilitator or a host, if you want to call it that, for a community practice, there's kind of 3 guidelines that you're trying to watch out for. The cause, so you're basically around what is the purpose, and clearly explaining that to the community and making them aware of the path, so that we're going in a certain direction, so they know that there's a mission here. And then you're showing that constant progress to them as well, and that's really important. And then what we spoke about earlier on is culture. So it's about their beliefs of the company, behaviors of the people as well inside, setting guidelines, not boundaries, and things like that. Communication is important as well. So when you are hosting or facilitating the community, it's about keeping the conversation moving, asking questions, and expressing gratitude as well. Huge thing. There's not enough of that happening, expressing gratitude when we are looking at new things. And that then builds that connection of safety, trust, and clarity. So I think earlier on I mentioned about like the structure of how the communities develop, let's say over 6 months, really, And I found a really good example of this, and it's called forming, storming, norming, and performing. Okay, so like forming is that early stage of the community of practice where nothing really happens yet. It's just that point where you're taking their coats and seating them, like I said earlier on. And then storming is the next stage, where that brings a bit of conflict, maybe, where people go, well, what am I doing here? Or, what's exactly is happening? And that's natural when you're trying to build trust and forming of people's opinions as well. And then the host just shows the way of the culture, etc. So it's just about keeping everything aligned. And then norming is a stage where the community begins to get it, trust begins to grow, they start to serve and show up to the community, and they see that common goal. They can see the path basically ahead. And then performing, that's where the community begins to work together on shared goals, and they start turning this kind of tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge that helps them with their careers, but also helps the company as well. And then let's say if you are then thinking of setting up a community of practice, the structure that I find quite good is that discovery stage. Do you remember we were talking about two people getting together for coffee? So what you could do there is you just have a chat with them, talk about what business impact they're trying to make, what they're trying to do for their own careers as well. And it's all about that shared interest. And then if you can take that further and begin a short workshop, and that's about aligning maybe the initial team that you want to put together for this community of practice. So again, these people can't be dragged into it. They have to have an interest in it. Try and get about 8 people into the initial community of practice. And then you can sit down and have these workshops on these shared goals, that sense of ownership that they're going to get from it and how it's going to ignite interest. And then you can structure the community of practice. You can build it. Maybe we'll talk about that, actually, the platforms in a few minutes, but that's an important area as well. So you can build these platforms then to get people moving fast and just getting them involved in the community of practice. Well, what I mean by moving fast is that there's a lot of platforms out there that are just ready to go. So it's literally white label. You can start going straight away. And then you launch. And then when you launch, you get into that 6-month phase of nurturing correct connections, guiding discussions, and trying to find those tangible actions as well for workshops, and what then gets brought into that explicit knowledge within the company. So I suppose what I've learned, kind of a summary of all of this, would be that, like this, we're in a world, like, the way the movie said, in a world fraught with danger. We're in that era now with like AI, etc., as mentioned. But AI is, I think it's just going to handle more of those routine work things. And it's also going to handle some of the things that maybe should be automated anyway, even in elements of design, user research, whatever it might be. But it then allows us, I think, to express these more uniquely human skills, and they then become more valuable. These things like that we all talk about in user research, etc., is like creativity, empathy, complex problem solving, etc. So communities of practice are where these skills can begin to develop even further. So I think we spend so much time, in development in different areas, building this kind of technical infrastructure, where I think AI can now be our friend to do some of that. But I think like the most important infrastructure always is human. So communities of practice are kind of how you build learning infrastructure that actually scales with people. So it's not really a nice to have, as they say. It really is a competitive advantage, I think, going forward. And like I said, it's very difficult to replicate. It really sits in with your culture as well, and it helps the organizations not just to survive change, but to get stronger from it, that anti-fragility as such. And I think it brings a whole lot of happiness to people along the way as well, which is really important. So it's the catalyst for a growth mindset, like I said earlier on, in companies.
Yeah, John, you mentioned about the tools.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. I kind of leave that to the end, because what I find to do, and like a lot of people in our industry, when we start talking about the tools, we get lost in them. We get under the hood, talking about gears, etc. But what I've been, what would you say, experimenting with are 3 different tools which are interesting, that are ready to go. Okay, so if you're internally within an organization and you're using Microsoft products, they have a product out at the moment called Viva Engage. And not many people know about it. Have you heard of it yourself, Nicola? I'm always interested.
No, actually, I haven't.
So Viva Engage is a really interesting one, and they've been doing updates to the product as well. So obviously it connects in with the whole Microsoft system. It's got AI built into the community of practice as well. It's growing, and I believe that it might get opened up outside of the Microsoft packages as such. But that's a really good one to play around with if you're talking about internal teams. If you're talking about, do you remember earlier on I was talking about those kind of external teams, people from different companies? What I've been using there, and it works really well, is a product called School, SKOOL. You've heard of that?
I think I know that one.
Yeah,
I think I have.
exactly. Like, there's loads of people using it for different things, but as a community practice and hit the ground running, I don't think there's anything faster. And it's got loads of little features in there that really make it sticky. And I think that's still a really exciting product. And then there is, let's say Microsoft Viva Engage. That's the Microsoft product system, and its content is within there, and School, the content's within the School platform as well. But there's another one called Campfire by, Basecamp, the product Basecamp, yeah. So they have, not many people talk about this one, but it's called Campfire, and you can buy it one time for like $300, and you just download it and you put it into your own servers, and it's yours.
Cool.
And it's quite light. It's very much just chat orientated, but it's a really good starting point, I think. But like I said, they're just 3 tools. Generally, there's 3 tools that work well. People might think about using things like Teachable. And do you remember earlier on we were talking about that it's not about courses. So
Yeah.
exactly. And I think Teachable, the focus is on courses. So community practice is not about courses. It's about people talking to each other and creating that space. So it's not I wouldn't call it a good app if you're thinking about using something like that, And what else? Yeah, I think they're the 3 main ones to watch out for, and you can play around with them. Literally just go online right now and start playing with them. But you can set them up in an afternoon,
Great. Thanks so much for the tips. Sometimes the barrier is just not knowing how small it can be just to start.
Yeah.
So
that's the thing. Just start small, get the conversation going. And if you can get enough people interested, definitely get it started. So like, in terms of books and stuff as well, we mentioned some earlier on, and there's a book by David Spinks on community. I can't remember the name of it now, but you'll find it. I think it's like SPI and KS. The Myth of the Objective. Again, these are 2 books that are not about communities of practice, and that's what I love. They help you connect the dots of what you believe the community of practice should be for you. The Myth of the Objective, I think that's a really interesting book. I think people would enjoy that because it talks a lot about AI and the non-objective, and it's very pertinent for today. So that's a really good book to read. And Rory Sutherland, he's a book called Alchemy, and it's about, if you do the same as everybody else, you won't get anything different. And he gives really good examples that might help you get along the way in creating a community of practice as well, and what the advantages and what you can get from it too.
John, thank you. This conversation really highlights how powerful it can be when people are given space to think, share, and listen without a tight agenda.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that strategy doesn't just happen in boardrooms. It starts with how people talk to each other.
It's time to be a little bit more human.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We'll link to your work and make in the show notes. Thanks again, John.
Thanks for having me.
To everyone listening to If You Seek, see you next time. For more exciting content, follow us on our social channels. Your reviews mean the world to us, so don't forget to leave one. And of course, hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest episodes. If You Seek is a platform for discussions and personal insights. The opinions presented by guests are independent and do not represent the official position of the host, Rewsbury, or our sponsors.